Okay, gang. Okay, so today's the 28th of May. This is a week 9 of our 10-week course. So we have, counting today, we have 4 additional meetings together. We're into the issue of part 3, which is the role that the traditional indigenous people of the world might potentially play in stopping global climate change. We would have gotten a little deeper into it by now, but we had the class here from the engineering classes, the sustainable engineering class. So we spent some time reviewing the context of where we are for them, so they understand it. But I want to move today into the actual substance of the potential role that the indigenous people play. We know now that the global climate change is in the process of inflicting catastrophic damage on the environmental system and the climatic system of the planet. We know that all the scientific predictions are now showing that the rate at which this catastrophic set of circumstances is descending upon us is faster than they had initially anticipated, and it is going to be graver in its consequences than had been originally anticipated. A couple of the more recent discoveries that have exacerbated these predictions, number one is the increasing likelihood that the Antarctic shelf may well collapse entirely with the melting of the ice fields, the ice on the water, that the support structures for holding the ice sheets on the land may well dissolve, and that those ice sheets on the land may well slide into the sea. And this is predicted now, if that happens in the Antarctic shelf, that would increase the global mean sea level by 215 feet. And there are now starting to be worked up by major scientific organizations the import of that 215-foot sea rise, showing the massive inundation of the entire valley here in California, where all the food stuff is grown, substantial portions of Santa Cruz below here, the major portions of Los Angeles and the whole Los Angeles basin, and of course the primary danger being that the 103 private nuclear plants that are in the United States are all within a mile or so of the seacoast. And it turns out that's also true of the other 300 nuclear power plants around the world. And that we know from Fukushima what the consequences are of seawater flooding into those nuclear reactors. And it causes the potential explosion of those reactors because the flooding of the water shuts off all the electricity, and it shuts off the pumps, and then the core melts down, because that's what it generates the heat for the generating of steam that drives the turbines that generate the electricity in those plants. So that the combination of the collapse of the Antarctic shelf, the increase of the mean global temperature, or the mean sea level of the planet, with those nuclear power plants along the coast, spell real major catastrophe for the planet, and that at the present rate of the emissions of global greenhouse gases, that collapse of the Antarctic shelf is in fact predicted will take place if it just continues like this for a short period more. The other major contribution to the exacerbated catastrophe now is the issue of the permafrost fields, mainly in the Arctic. That entire band of permafrost, it's got predicted 1.7 trillion tons of methane beneath the surface. Almost a quarter of the land mass in the Arctic is exposed to that particular threat. In that expulsion of the methane gas, remember that methane is 25 times, at least 25 times more damaging in its release into the atmosphere as a global greenhouse gas emission than carbon. And then it degenerates into carbon. But this is another major catastrophe in the offing. And now what they've discovered is that the danger of all of this extra fresh water melting from the shelves, the Arctic and Antarctic shelves, and all of the sea ice and the glaciers, is going to lessen the density of the ocean water and mix it with fresh water. And in decreasing the density of the ocean water, the salt water, is going to potentially cause the underwater currents to rise to the surface and dissipate. And these currents are the currents that carry the warm water from the equatorial regions of the planet up into and down into the areas of temperate zones where food is grown. And of course, the additional factor that they've known about for some time is, with the rise of the sea level, the contamination with salt water of the underground aquifers all along the 2 to 5 mile area along the coastlines that will be inundated with salt water. And when that fresh water is contaminated in the aquifer, it travels in the aquifer beneath the ground to lengths vastly beyond just the seacoast. So the increased seriousness of the consequences that have been now recognized by the scientific community confronts us with this need to, as Greta Thunberg pointed out, to move away from attempting to just try to determine what the presently politically feasible options are, to try to bring this to a halt, and to actually start determining what it is that has to be done. And this raises fundamental questions about the present rate at which the non-Native American and non-Indigenous cultures of the planet are taking steps to address this, because we know that not only was the conduct of our sort of European and other Caucasian dominated nation states way too slow in attempting to respond to this threat, but the fact is that now under Trump they're actually increasing it, and on the front lines of those attempted increases are the building of the pipelines that are coming. What you discover is that all along this band of the about 45 degrees of north latitude across the planet, you find these massive oil fields that all the way from the Bakken oil fields up in northern North Dakota and in southern Canada, the tar sand fields, all the way through into Iran and Persia, and into the Middle East, and into Russia, around the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea and the Arctic shelf of Russia. That this is where the overwhelming percentage of the oil resides, and the pipelines are being planned to move the oil and natural gas from those areas at approximately 45 degrees north latitude down into the warm water ports, to get them down to anywhere from 30 to 25 degrees north latitude, which ranges from the Gulf of Mexico all the way through to the Sea of Arabia. In the Sea of Arabia, there's a certain Gulf of Oman, which is where they're planning to try to build those pipelines that were supposed to go through Afghanistan, and that have been held up now because of the uprising of the traditional tribal people in those areas. And so we know that the actions that were being undertaken before Trump got here were inadequate, and now they're affirmatively worse than inadequate. They're actually attempting to increase the amount of petroleum and natural gas being generated, not only here in North America, but as we've touched on, over in Russia. Whether it's proven or not that Trump and Putin were personal partners in the inter-trust group that are the secret purchasers of a 20% interest in the former Russian national oil company or not, we know that Rosneft, the actual Russian oil corporation, is in fact forward-leaning and dedicated to trying to pump out those 87 billion barrels of oil and the 30% of the natural gas on the planet. And we know that in order for them to make that productive, they have to pipe it down from that area down into the warm water ports. And so the rising up of the traditional indigenous tribal people in that area of the world, stopping the construction of those pipelines, has proved instrumental. One of the reasons that Russia may well have gone into Afghanistan to attempt to establish Russian hegemony over Afghanistan was an attempt to open up the potentials of that pipeline. In the rising up of the Afghan people and the indigenous people who are Wahhabists and fundamentalist Islamicists to oppose Russia's invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, and more recently to rise up to push out of that area of the world the occupation forces of the United States and the Western corporations. That is ongoing at the present time. So we're aware of that type of activity on the part of the indigenous tribal people, and we've seen it all around. And your daily headlines can show what's going on. And we'll get to the question of the tribal peoples taking steps beyond simply placing landmines under the roads and stuff for the military vehicles that have been brought in to support the occupation of the oil fields, and actually undertaking armed attacks against the military installations of the U.S., primarily U.S. military forces in that area, that there's the additional question of them potentially taking that military and paramilitary effort on their part outside of the Holy Lands, outside of the oil fields, and going down into Africa and bombing the American embassies there, attacking the USS Cole in the harbor in Yemen, and potentially attacking targets in the United States. At least the first attempt at setting off explosives under the trade towers, that we know that there were indigenous tribal people from the Middle East involved in that initial attack. And as we know, that there's the assertion, at any rate, in the 9/11 Commission, that it was the indigenous tribal people that supervised the attack against the trade towers and the Pentagon. And so that we see that local effort to disrupt the occupying forces in the Middle East, occupying the Middle Eastern oil fields. We see it potentially evolving into an attempt to export that threat from that local area in the world directly where the occupying forces are, into actually attacking the people in their homeland, to try to generate if not support on the part of the local population in the United States and North America, but at least a resistance to the continued policies of the United States. It's very similar to what we saw going on in Northern Ireland when the IRA, Republican Army of the Irish people, rose up against the British and mounted their attacks. They first began attacking them on site there, the occupation forces of the United Kingdom, but then they brought the fight to the island of England and began bombing sites there against civilian populations to try to make it clear to the civilian population that their continued sort of passive support for the policies of their government by continuing to pay taxes, continuing to reelect the same people that were doing it, etc., that the directing of the attack against the civilian population played some significant role in causing the authorities in the UK to be more willing to conduct negotiations with the Irish Republican Army to try to alleviate the oppression of some of the people by the UK forces in Ireland. So that this is an issue we're going to put off for a bit, but the discussion of the lengths to which some of the indigenous people have gone to try to stop the occupation and the drilling of their oil fields and the exportation and exploitation of their oil has reached fairly large proportions. And of course, we have seen people like Steve Bannon, as the chief political advisor for Donald Trump, transforming that entire activity on the part of the indigenous people into a call for Western Caucasian people to combine together to actually mount a bloody third world war against the indigenous people, asserting that they constitute a threat to Western culture, asserting that they actually wish to establish some type of worldwide caliphate or to challenge our way of life, as they put it. So you've seen Steve Bannon rise all the way to the top of the political advisors of Donald Trump and actually have a seat inside the National Security Council, where he is openly advocating that the national defense establishment inside the United States treat the indigenous people in the Dakotas as anti-Christian, anti-capitalist, religiously driven indigenous jihadist terrorists, and to apply to them the same exact tactics that have been developed by the United States military and the Central Intelligence Agency in the Middle East against them. And we've seen the additional step of them spinning off these private military corporations like Blackwater International and Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation to pull themselves out from under any of the restrictions that are imposed upon U.S. military forces occupying those areas, so that they think they can be free. These private military people be free of the Geneva Conventions and other types of restraints on the kind of tactics that they can deploy. And now we see, we have to check to see what the latest is on this, but remember that Donald Trump is actually contemplating granting pardons to the Blackwater International private military people who were convicted of war crimes, of murdering innocent civilians in the Middle East in their zeal to protect the oil interests in the Middle East. So that's the status that we see taking place with regard to the indigenous peoples of the Middle East right now. What we want to do today is we want to turn our attention to the activities that have been taken to date on the part of the indigenous people of North America to try to intervene in the building of these pipelines from approximately 45 degrees north latitude down through the entire central United States, through the Lakota territory, the great Sioux Nation, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, where they're going to be refined and shipped out for sale, not addressing any type of purported domestic energy crisis here in the United States, but instead solely for profit, for increasing the profit of the stockholders of the major oil corporations that have purchased those oil interests throughout North America. So that I want to today now, how many of you, if any, were actually at the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. Okay, none of us here. Okay, but how many of you had friends or acquaintances that you know that were there? Just a couple. Okay, well, as you know, this event that took place basically from the middle of June of 2016 all the way through to the end of February of 2017, that has been known as the No DAPL movement, the Dakota Access Pipeline, is asserted to have been initiated and instigated and overseen by the Lakota people. The Lakota people being the Lakota speakers, in Dakota speakers, but they're just dialects of the Lakota language. That these are the people of the Great Sioux Nation. These are the people of the Seven Council Fires that actually were indigenous to the plains, central plains of the Dakotas for 1,000 years before the white people came there. And the assertion has been made by the Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation that Chase Iron Eyes was the ringleader and initiator of these tactics against the pipeline. The Dakota Access Oil Pipeline hired the Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation. They built out an entire chart of who they thought all the people were that were participating in this criminal terrorist organization against the pipeline. And what they did, of course, is they began to project upon the Lakota people whatever it is that they had developed in their own mind as essentially what they would do if they were in the place of those native people. They would say, okay, obviously, you know, if you're not going to stand for the pipeline being built right through your homeland and under your sole source of drinking water, you're going to take extreme measures. You know, you're not going to stop by just asking them to stop doing that. You're not going to stop just by asking the state legislature in South Dakota or North Dakota to make them stop. You know, you're not going to stop with just sort of camping out there and being a witness to the injustice of the building of these pipelines under your fresh water source. The Tiger Swan Private Military people, because they're trained in guerrilla and anti-guerrilla tactics, because the special forces of the United States Army and the SEAL teams were specifically created for the purpose of countering indigenous people rising up against military occupation forces of the United States military. That's how they came into being. I was in them for 2 years. I know what it is they were training us to try to do. And they kept on being initially confused by why it was that the local people didn't seem to be supportive of them being there. And that they kept, because they were drinking the Kool-Aid of the propaganda of the United States State Department and the military, the Pentagon, asserting that we were going there to try to establish or to maintain democracy. And it didn't take very long for a person actually being in the field to discover that that wasn't true, that isn't what they were doing, because they were supporting, you know, fascist dictators that had been put into place. For example, in Hanoi, in South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, you know, was a graduate student at Columbia University. And was flown over there and put into power by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, taking over for the French that had been in there since the late 1890s, when they in fact seized Saigon and occupied it and tried to turn it into a colony for the French. In that entire history of French Indochina. That entire time period, at the end of, we won't go into too much detail here, but at the end of World War II, when the French had been driven out of Vietnam and out of Indochina by the Japanese invading forces, when it came to the end of World War II and the Japanese were forced to retreat, the French wanted to go back in and reoccupy the area. Franklin Roosevelt did not want them to do that, actually. And it wasn't at that time because he wanted the United States to go in their stead. But he thought that at the end of World War II, that the major imperial powers that had predated World War II should step back from this imperial venture and should allow the indigenous people to operate their own homeland, as they had for tens of thousands of years prior to our arrival. And so what happened, in short, is that when the French went back into, actually when the Japanese started invading Vietnam, and the French sent out appeals, radio appeals, asking the United States to send in military forces to protect them, Franklin Roosevelt actually ordered the 5th Air Force to stand down and do not go to their aid so that they would have to evacuate and leave. And when it came to the end of World War II, when he tried to stop the French from going back in and reoccupying that territory, the French went in anyhow, and the French reoccupied French Indochina. And so the indigenous population rose up against them and actually mounted a revolutionary war against them, in the same way that the American colonists had, in fact, risen up and mounted a revolutionary war against the British here in North America back in the 1770s. Okay, so what happened is that when the Indo-Chinese, as they referred to them, or the Vietnamese, encircled the French finally at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and General Giap actually went up and mounted the mountain range surrounding Dien Bien Phu, and they had disassembled mortar and carried them up on their backs and climbed up the mountain ridges and reassembled them all around Dien Bien Phu and started pouring in mortar fire onto the French troops. The French troops surrendered, and the Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh actually gave them the opportunity to leave and said, look, we're going to cease fire. We want you to leave, and you can go back down below the I remember with 54th parallel. I can't remember exactly which parallel it was. What, pardon? 17th parallel. You know, they could retreat below that, and then they'd give them time to mount up and ship out and get out of there. And so the French did that. They had a peace negotiation. They entered into a major peace negotiation and agreed to do this. And when the French were prepared to start pulling out, the United States government, under Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, developed a covert program to go in and replace the French. And this is when they went and got Diem, Ngo Dinh Diem, and flew him into, quote, South Vietnam. They created an entire new country of South Vietnam as distinct from North Vietnam. They said, well, we got away with it in Korea, and set up a South Korea as opposed to Korea itself. And so they tried it again. And the indigenous people who had organized to drive the Japanese out earlier and had driven out the French turned their paramilitary forces and guerrilla forces against the United States. And as you know, that war just escalated and escalated and escalated because the United States, under the regime of Eisenhower and Nixon to begin with, but then under Kennedy in his first term, you know, they just thought that if you applied more force to these people, maybe you could win that way in just a straight application of massive, overwhelming military force. But what was shown, and it becomes critical for our discussions here in the next several lectures, is that it turns out that doesn't work. It turns out it doesn't work if, in fact, the indigenous people who reside in that area are on the side of the guerrilla forces that are attempting to push out the occupying powers. And so that the frame of mind of really understanding the forces as being occupying forces is critical, because then the regular people who live in the area view them as the adversary, and that they're open at least to viewing the people among their own population who rise up and engage in paramilitary activity and even military activity against the occupying forces, end up lending support to the guerrillas, and that's what happened in Vietnam. And so that what you saw is that in Vietnam, it was actually sort of the paradigmatic example of indigenous tribal people rising up and forcing a Western power, Caucasian military power, to force them out of their territory, because the occupying forces have come in to try to exploit the resources of that area. In this particular case, it was also including an attempt on the part of the United States to establish a forward military base into Southeast Asia. That they had gotten South Korea established, but they were unable to get a land base further projected into Southeast Asia, so they made this effort to establish that in Vietnam. Now, some of that had been happenstance because, as I pointed out, the French had gone in almost by accident, actually. They actually, when I think it was in 1898, the French had actually gone into the harbor at Saigon, and all of their sailors got off the ship and went ashore, and they were hanging out there, carousing, and some type of a confrontation broke out in the marketplace, and somehow they asserted at least that they were fired upon by some of the people in the indigenous community, and so all the French sailors withdrew to the ship and then fired on the town with their cannons from the ship and took it. And then they had to try to communicate back home with France to say, now what do we do? Because that wasn't their original intention of actually even going in and taking the place. But the French said, well, keep it. We'll see what we can do with it. And they spent decades trying to figure out how to make the place profitable, from 1898 all the way through to basically 1954. Rubber plantations and sugar beets and everything else, and it wasn't that they were succeeding in making it a profitable undertaking, but they wanted to stay there as a symbol of imperial power on the part of France. And when they were ultimately defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and withdrew, the United States went in saying, well, almost like the French said, well, as long as it's there, and as long as there's an opportunity for us just to slide in and take the place of the French here, let's do that and sort of increase our reach into Southeast Asia from South Korea into Vietnam, and that's what they did, and we know how that worked out. But it's important to remember now, and that's I'm framing our issues here because there's still a major historical question, a fact, about what the comparative roles were of the indigenous people rising up against the occupying forces of the United States in Vietnam, supported by the local indigenous people on the one hand, and them combining not only their military and paramilitary activities against the occupying power, but the non-cooperation of the local population, refusing to be supportive of the military occupation, not lending them assistance, not participating with them, not paying taxes to them, not doing any of that stuff. There's a combination on the part of the indigenous people of active non-cooperation with the occupying powers and the paramilitary action that's being undertaken against them, which I'll explain in a minute, and the direct military engagement with the occupying forces. On the one hand, the question of what role, how dispositive was that combined effort on the part of the indigenous people to push the occupying powers out of Vietnam, and on the other hand, what role was played by the white people by the population here in the United States, of the young men refusing to respond to the induction orders, the refusal of people to pay taxes, people mounting major demonstrations against them, marching in the streets, putting 1 million people into the streets of Washington, D.C., surrounding Richard Nixon in the White House, with him cringing behind the windows of the White House, looking out at the people marching by. A lot of the stories that you hear. This is what we lived through in our generation, the baby boomer generation, of a mounting and escalating opposition to the war in Vietnam from here. Just parenthetically, it's very similar to what happened to the French, not only in Vietnam, but the French had occupied Algeria. And there's a very famous movie. It was really quite popular and quite troublesome to J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA, that there was a movie that was called The Battle for Algiers. And it was a dramatic reenactment, almost like a documentary film with documentary footage of the people of Algeria rising up against the French occupation forces and engaging in non-cooperation with the occupying forces of France, then in paramilitary activity, and then in full-scale military activity against them. And the resort to which the French occupying forces went to try to suppress them, to the point where they were in such flagrant violation of basic Judeo-Christian social ethical principles that they began to collapse any of their support back among the homeland people in France. The people of France were horrified at the kind of torture that was going on, the disappearance of dissidents, the capturing of them and imprisoning them in these horrible conditions, and most importantly, the torturing of the people to try to get them to rat out any of the people that were working with them to oppose, through military means, the occupation in Algeria. And so that movie, The Battle for Algiers, made its way around underground into all these movie theaters all around the country. It was being shown on campuses, on Friday night movies and everything. And the FBI was going nuts over this because it seemed to be somehow advocating this type of activity, even to the point of kind of giving them instructions on how you'd go about doing this effectively. And the point of it all wasn't lost on the FBI, at least, so they could see what was happening in the United States. And so it harkens back to that effort on the part of France in that case to not only hold on to its colony in Vietnam, but also holding on to its colony in Algeria. And step by step, the French people, the population, mainly the students and the faculty members in the universities, in the labor unions, and eventually the churches, actually rose up and started organizing against the political leadership in France to insist that they withdraw from Vietnam and insist that they withdraw from Algeria. But they were ultimately crushed militarily at Dien Bien Phu. And so that sort of resolved that one. It was clear that the Vietnamese people had played the definitive role in militarily defeating the French in Indochina, so that whatever lengths were being gone to by the local population in the homeland of France to get them to leave Vietnam, while it may have contributed to their departure, it was clear that it was the military activity of the Vietnamese people that ended up being dispositive in that case. But in Algeria, it was clear that it was the moral undermining of their entire occupation in Algeria that took the toll on the local people at home in France. And the French people eventually went on strike, and they had huge strikes, and eventually started refusing to pay taxes to the French government if they wouldn't leave. Algeria. And so you see examples of what has happened with indigenous people rising up against an exterior occupying force. And we see that happening with regard to the Middle Eastern oil fields. And so that we come back to the question of North America now. That what we have an example here in the United States where these major oil corporations, directly in the face of the meetings in Paris, not coincidentally, in France, holding the major meetings of 193 nation states, all agreeing that the global climate change constituted a clear and present danger to the entire global climatic system, and that insisting that major steps be taken to reduce the oil production and the burning of fossil fuels. And yet, directly in the face of that type of a resolution, in December of 2015, you find within a year, in November of 2016, the major oil corporations and corporate powers and stuff backing Trump being elected. And he brings into office this complete petroleum cabinet, of Rex Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil, as the Secretary of State, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency as being the Attorney General of Oklahoma, a major oil state, Scott Pruitt, bringing in as his head of the Department of Energy, Rick Perry, the governor of, not only the governor of Texas, a major oil state, but also the vice president of Sunoco Logistics, one of the partners in the Dakota Access Pipeline. That whole thing came in as a basic thumb in the eye of the people of the world who had come to this resolution of having to take dramatic steps to cut back on the production and burning of fossil fuels. And now you've got an administration in there that is just in flagrant disregard of all of those steps that have been taken and in open defiance of the collective community in the world to try to protect our climate on the planet. And so the question that arises now is, to what lengths are people willing to go to stop them from basically destroying the climate system of the planet? If in fact we agree that with the science that's been undertaken in the studies of global climate change, if we understand and agree with the projected catastrophic consequences, if in fact we agree with them pointing out that the rate at which these catastrophic consequences are descending upon us is even faster than they had thought, and that the degree of catastrophe is worse than they had thought. If we in fact believe all of that to be true, what does it take to have this translate into some kind of an existential threat? That is a threat to the existence of your life and the life of your families to get people to be mobilized. Now, what happened in Algeria, as I pointed out, is that there was a conscious campaign undertaken by the Algerians to engage in paramilitary activities against the occupying military forces. And when the French occupying military forces kept escalating the degree of cruelty that they would deploy against the people in Algeria, of torturing them, disappearing them, murdering their families in order to drive them out of hiding, the kind of things that are laid out in the battle for Algiers. And what happened is the Algerian indigenous people, what they did is they began to share this information with the people back in France, and that they were engaged in a very sophisticated public education campaign, revealing to the people of France the untoward lengths to which their military was going to try to hold on to a colony, and it began to undermine them. Of course, now that of course brings us to the classic example of Gandhi, in India, when Gandhi and others, Sri Aurobindo and his lawyer and other people started organizing to try to humiliate the British occupying forces in India, the kind of racist, self-serving, exploitative activities of England and the UK in India against the indigenous people. In that particular case, Mahatma Gandhi, organized a major, what amounted to a public education campaign to, on the one hand, sort of solicit more and more extreme responses on the part of the British occupying military command, and then the publication of those kind of cruel activities that they were engaged in by sharing that information with the people back in England, banking on the effectiveness of the earlier Roman Catholic Church, then later the Lutheran Church and the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, to have effectively instilled in the people of England an abhorrence to that type of activity. You know, that there were classic things. For example, when the British were importing salt into India, and the East Indian Corporation had a monopoly on selling salt. What Gandhi organized and developed, and remember that Gandhi was a lawyer. I just put that in for all of you who are on your way to law school. That what he did is and this is an important thing, is that he endeavored for years to try to bring legal actions against the government of the UK. He tried to organize people peacefully, tried to petition them. He tried to do as a lawyer, was trying to work entirely within the juridical legal system to try to persuade the British authorities to stop doing what they were doing and to withdraw from India. And he basically despaired of this, because in a very symbolic event that took place, he was actually dressed all up in his suit and tie and everything as a person from India, and he was on a train, and he was going to a court hearing, and the Caucasian conductors on the train dragged him out of the first class cabin, saying he couldn't stay there because he was a Wog, you know, and that they just wouldn't tolerate him being there, and they dragged him off the thing and eventually threw him physically off the train. And so he basically got up and said, okay, that's it. You know, I've given them their chance. I've supplicated them. I've petitioned them. I've asked them. I've invoked their own rules and regulations and concepts of common law decency to them, and it's not working. It's perfectly clear that something more radical has to be done. And so he basically stripped down and took his suit off and everything and threw it beside the railroad tracks and walked away, and set about figuring out what else had to be done. Okay, now I raise that because what he decided in that instance, for example, was that he sat and meditated and reflected upon this, and he finally got the insight that if in fact the East India Company, backed by the military forces of the UK, occupying them as a colonial power, were going to assert this monopoly control over all the salt distribution in the country, that what he would do is he would simply get himself and a few of his followers, and they would march to the sea, and that they would in fact start taking salt out of the sea and getting their own salt. That's what they would do. And so as he set off to do this march, more and more people joined with him all through India. And eventually there were thousands and thousands of people marching to the sea and taking the salt out of the sea, processing it out of the sea, and boycotted the salt of the East India Company. And they did the same thing with regard to cloth. The East India Company had a monopoly on linen cloth. And so what Gandhi did is he helped organize all the people around India to learn how to weave their own linen. And he had these little spinning wheels, and he would sit there for a couple hours each day and have the people film him. You know, big lawyer, big smart guy, big organizer, all that kind of stuff, sitting there hour after hour just spinning linen and making cloth. And he insisted upon just wearing this little loincloth with a piece of linen over his shoulder in adopting the old ancient costume of the Indian people, and completely eschewing any attempt to placate the British authorities by dressing up and wearing a suit when he went to meet with them, and he would constantly go and do that. And you track the record of that in the rising levels of contempt on the part of the British authorities for Gandhi, because he was humiliating them, and he was just rubbing their nose in it, and they would have sit-down strikes and stuff. They would refuse to pay for any tickets riding on the trains that the Brits ran. Then they would go and sit in at the train station. They'd come in with like 5,000 people, and they would just occupy the train station and sit there. And then what happens is the British military would wade into them with nightsticks and clubs and start beating them, at which point the Gandhi's people would just set up these old-timey little movie film cameras, and they're grinding away, taking photos and videoing or recording on film, little 8mm film, I guess, or 16mm film, what they were doing to them. And then they would make copies of it, and they would send them to England. And the people started showing them all around in little house parties and stuff like that, showing these spit and polished, British military guys clubbing these poor native people that were just sitting there in the train station. And so this tactic was developed by Gandhi, and it presents another alternative. We saw what had happened directly in Vietnam. We've seen what happened sort of as a middle stage in Algeria against the French. We've seen now Gandhi doing what he was doing against the British. And so you'll see that there are a range of options that you have. And so what I want to do is I want to talk to you about those that were deployed. Oh, I just thought we're working at making a little bumper sticker that Chris does. See this? What would Greta do? Yeah, we thought this was cool. I took it outside. But we can get copies of this for you and put it on your bikes. Anyway, let me tell you now, because you weren't there, and if most of you didn't even have somebody close to you that had gone there to keep track of it all, that what happened here is that there was oil discovered up in Stanley, North Dakota, actually where Sarah Nelson, my wife of 40 years, and the executive director of our institute was raised in Stanley, North Dakota, this little town, 1,300 people. Oil was discovered there in 1990 or something like that. And all of a sudden, the oil companies came flooding in and starting to punch oil wells all throughout this little town. Completely destroyed the whole town. I mean, I'd seen it before they were ever there. But you can stand on her front porch, Sarah's front porch, and look out, and all you see is hundreds of these little pumps pumping away. Like you can see down in Kern County, when you're going down to LA, driving down the 101, you can see them off there in Kern County. There's dozens and dozens of those little pumpers. But they were everywhere. And in the nighttime, you can see the gas burning off from these oil wells, and it just makes this kind of weird, eerie orange glow all throughout the whole area. And then what they discovered is that it was so huge, the oil strike there at the Bakken oil fields, that they decided they were going to build a pipeline that was going to go from Stanley, North Dakota, all the way down through North America, all the way to the Gulf Coast, where it was going to be refined in the little town, actually, where Karen Silkwood lived, down in Texas. And they were going to be refining it and then shipping it out for sale. Not intending to use a single drop of the oil to relieve any purported domestic oil shortage or energy crisis in the United States. And they were originally planning to come down from Actually, they go a bit west of Stanley and then come down southward, and then they were going to turn eastward north, 10 miles north of Bismarck, North Dakota. 92% white community. And it's important to remember, North Dakota is the whitest state in the entire United States, population-wise. It's got 91% white people in North Dakota. And virtually all the rest of the people are Native American. And so the oil corporation, it was called the Energy Transfer Partners Corporation, which was a combine of a whole bunch of oil companies. You know, Marathon Oil and Sunoco and a whole bunch of major oil companies set up a subsidiary to build the pipeline. And it was called the Energy Transfer Partners. Okay? And then what they would do is they would set up a further subsidiary, an LLC, focusing on just a particular pipeline. And so they had an LLC that was called the Dakota Oil Pipeline, the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline. And that's where the DAPL comes from, Dakota Access Pipeline. And that they were going to build this pipeline almost due south out of Stanley, and then it was going to turn eastward 10 miles north of the 92% population Bismarck, North Dakota, and then go under the Missouri River, and then over on the other side of the Missouri River, going to go down all the way down to Illinois, where it would hook into an additional extension of that same pipeline. They would go all the way down to Louisiana, and then it would hook into this thing called the Bayou Bridge pipeline that was going to go right to the Gulf of Mexico, where it would be refined and then shipped out on tankers. And what happened is that whole plan was going on, and then up in Canada, they discovered that given the new technologies, they could in fact pump superheated steam and certain chemicals into the ground, and they could get out of the tar sands in southern Canada. They could extract the oil, or they could actually get the tar sands moving so that they mixed them with all this hot steaming water and chemicals, and that they could get them so they were like slush, and then they could pump it through a pipeline. And so that they had this other pipeline that was called the Keystone XL pipeline, and they were going to build this pipeline due south from central Canada, down through Lakota territory again, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And these two pipelines were in the planning stage when the Obama administration, under pressure from the environmentalists to try to cut back on oil production, et cetera, and prior to the actual meetings in Paris in December of 2015, that the Obama administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, protested the protested the XL pipeline because of this terrible sludge that they were going to be pumping all the way through the middle of the country, and it had these terrible chemicals in it, and any kind of oil spill would just poison the area anywhere it went. And so since it originated in Canada, the president had the authority through his executive decision-making to refuse permission as part of his ability to conduct treaties and stuff under his constitutional authority under Article 2. He, in fact, denied the authority to the Canadian pipeline company to build this pipeline down through the United States. So he had stopped that. And so the energy then turned to building this Dakota Access Pipeline. There was a major priority on getting this done. Yes?
So I think in Article 2 it says that the president needs to get approval from the Congress to ratify the treaties. Did that happen?
No, that's if it's a treaty. And in this particular case, that he has, as you see Trump now exercising tariff authority and all that stuff that he's doing, the President of the United States has certain authority that's delegated to him by Congress through various pieces of legislation that authorize the President of the United States to refuse to allow a private corporation from a foreign government to operate inside the United States if he chooses to. And so he exercised that authority to prohibit the Keystone XL from coming down into the United States. So Canada had the option of potentially building a pipeline from the tar sands in central Canada all the way to the west coast into the Pacific Ocean, or all the way to the east coast there. But what they wanted to come due south, because they wanted to come all the way down to the oil refineries down on the Gulf of Mexico that were already there. And they didn't want to have to build new ones on the west coast or east coast. So that they were rabidly in favor of coming down through the United States to do this. But Obama had shut them off. And so what happened is they turned their energies into accelerating this Dakota Access Pipeline. And what they started doing, it was extraordinary, that what they did is their lawyers, this is the dark side of lawyering, the lawyers for the Dakota Access Pipeline Company, what they did is said, oh, wait a second, the Environmental Protection Act requires that if you are going to build an underground pipeline of more than like 500 feet, you need to apply for an environmental impact. You need to provide an environmental impact study, and then it has to be examined by the EPA, et cetera. But so what they did is the pipeline company kept applying for like 499 yard pipeline authorization, like you're going to build a pipeline from your house down to your boathouse or something. So they didn't have to apply for, they didn't have to undertake an EA, an environmental assessment, and they didn't have to do an environmental impact statement. And then they would build the 499 yards of the pipeline, and then they would stop and they would apply for another one. And they just kept on doing this. And they started coming down all the way from Stanley, all the way down in north of Bismarck. And then they were getting set to turn east to go 10 miles north of Bismarck to go to the go to the other side of the Missouri River and then southward. And what happened is that, and there's a big long debate about this, and we spent days investigating this, and it turns out that there was a report in the Bismarck Tribune that said that there had been a decision made to change the route of the pipeline from 10 miles north of Bismarck to 1/2 mile north of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. Because of, it said in the article, because of the opposition to building the pipeline 10 miles north of Bismarck, because the people in Bismarck had opposed it out of a fear that it would contaminate their fresh drinking water. Okay? Now this is 10 miles north of their town. And we looked into it, and there are 5 or 6 little tributaries that the pipeline would cross that pipeline. There was no evidence that any of those little tributaries were instrumental in providing fresh drinking water to the city of Bismarck. But the Tribune article said that they because of the opposition on the part of the population of Bismarck, that there had been a decision made by the pipeline company to change the route of the pipeline, and instead of going due east there, it was going to turn and come down and go down southward, and it was going to go right through Lakota territory. I mean, and it turns out that the boundary line of the U.S. government recognized reservation, the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, stopped it was some 290 yards short of where the pipeline was going to be going. But all of that land was traditional Native American land. Worse yet, it had been originally part of the reservation, and that land had been taken away from them through an act of eminent domain back in 1954 by the Eisenhower administration. They just declared eminent domain over that area of land because they were going to build a dam, a hydroelectric dam on the Missouri River. And they wanted to back up the reservoir behind that dam to generate the electrical power through the turbines in that dam. And so that they just came in and they commandeered that territory from the Lakota people. I mean, after they'd already been driven off 99% of all their land and driven onto this little reservation, the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, the U.S. government comes in and unilaterally asserts eminent domain over their land and takes it away from them. And this was like 90% of the arable land where they were growing most of their food and where all the berry bushes were all along the Missouri River, etc. And there were lots of people lived there, and they just ousted them all. They ousted them all. And as it turns out, worse yet, this land where they were going to be building the pipeline on hadn't even become part of the reservoir. It was still completely dry land, and they had taken it under the auspices of needing that land to put the reservoir in, and they weren't even using that land anymore. But they still kept it. Okay? And it was supposed to expire 50 years after that, and it was going to be expiring in one more year. And then they were going to have to give that land back to the Lakota people, pursuant to that original exercise of eminent domain, because they hadn't used it. Okay? And so the pipeline rushes in and starts building the pipeline right there, and then they're going to build the pipeline under the Oahe River, or the Oahe Lake, which was the backed up reservoir. So what you got is the Missouri River coming down, the big hydroelectric dam being put in there. It backs up this big reservoir up onto the land of the Lakota people, up over what would be normally the boundary of the Missouri River, onto their land. And then this land is north of that, but it's not in the reservoir at all, and was destined to have to be given back to the Lakota people within a year. And so what the pipeline people did is they rushed in to get the pipeline built right through there, because they considered it part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers land. It was owned by the United States as part of the dam that was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So that was Corps of Engineers land. And so what happened is, as soon as the Lakota people who lived on Standing Rock found out that this was happening, Phyllis Young, who was a member of the tribal council, was assigned by the tribal council to figure out how to stop this pipeline. Well, it turns out that Phyllis Young works with us at the Lakota People's Law Office up there, okay? And that she and Madonna Thunderhawk and Chase Iron Eyes and a number of other people that work for and with our institute, that Phyllis started organizing the people to do something about this. So here's where we get a range of tactics that are available here. Now, so here comes the pipeline getting set to come within 250 yards or so of the technical border, the boundary of the new smaller Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, with the land having been taken away from it through eminent domain back in 1954, 1 year away from being returned to them. But on that land that they're going to drill the pipeline, and they're going to go under Lake Oahe, which is the sole source of fresh drinking water for the people on the entire reservation, okay? And when the people find out about this, what happens is a group called Red Warrior Society. The Red Warrior Society is actually an English name for a band, not a band, but a warrior group that was part of the Ogallala. And the Ogallala are one of the 7 bands that are part of the Lakota Council Fire. Okay, and just for your basic information, the people of the 7 council fires, the Ocheti Sakoan, Oyate they call them, the people of the 7 council fires, there are, as you might guess, 7 different council fires. And one of the council fires is the Teton, the Teton people, and that's the council fire is the Teton, and then that's one of 7 different council fires. Each council fire has 7 bands, and that's where you get the Lakota and the Umpapa and the others, the Yakani. There are 7 bands, and each one of those 7 bands has 7 clans, and each one of the 7 clans has 7 Teoshpai, or large extended family. And each one of the Teoshpai have 7 Oshpai, which are other extended families. So the head of your Oshpai the family head of the Oshbai, sits with the 6 other heads of the Oshbai that are part of the Teoshbai, and then they pick one of them to sit on the council of the Teoshbai. And then the 7 Teoshbai head men pick one of them to sit on the council for the clan. And then the 7 clansmen pick one of them to sit as on the board of the 7 members of the band. And then, of course, they pick one who sits on the council fire. And so this is the self-governing mechanism that the people had. And it's not a democratic system. It's not. They don't have voting. They don't put purple dye on your thumb because you voted. And they don't, you don't register to vote. What it is it's a process that has existed for thousands of years by means of which the indigenous people determine what they're going to be doing collectively. Now, most of the time, they didn't have to convene the 7 council fires because it wasn't something that all of the people in all 7 council fires had to deal with. The last time previous to this that they had actually gathered and met was the attack against Custer and wiped out the 7th Cavalry. That was attempting, a long story there. And we could go on forever and ever about the history and the injustices to these people, as you might guess. But the bottom line is that of the Ogallala, which is one of the bands of the Tetuan Sioux, that they live down on the southern portion of what is called the state of South Dakota, right on the Nebraska border. In the Ogallala, are on a reservation that's called the Pine Ridge Reservation. And this is the place where they had the famous occupation of Wounded Knee. This is the location of the Wounded Knee camp, where back in 1891, actually 1890, December, there was this massacre that the 7th Cavalry slaughtered hundreds of women and children and old men that were there encamped and slaughtered them. And it stands in infamy among the Lakota people. But this is where the famous occupation of Wounded Knee took place back in 1973, organized by the American Indian movement. Russell Means and Dennis Banks and Vernon and Clyde Bellecourt and also Madonna Thunderhawk and others. And this is where I first became involved back in 1973. I was asked to come out and be co-counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union to actually be filing amicus briefs in the case of the occupation, because the federal government under Richard Nixon had come in and charged the leadership of the American Indian movement with insurrection, in rioting, in murder, and assault, and jaywalking and spitting on the sidewalk. They everything they could think of, they lowered the boom on the American Indian movement leadership. So we came in there and filed briefs to get all of the charges dismissed against all of them on the grounds of prosecutorial misconduct, because of a wide range of criminal activities that the FBI was engaging with in. And so we won that motion. And so because of that, I had gotten to know a significant number of the leadership of the American Indian movement. I became the attorney for Russell Means and a lot of different things that he was involved in. And I represented Madonna Thunderhawk and others. So I knew all the people sort of on a first name basis. And so I had gotten invited to come back in to South Dakota back in 2004 to work on a major problem of their children were being taken away again. And you probably have all heard that back in the 1880s, the United States government had this policy of physically removing children. When they got to be 5 years old, they would remove them from their parents and their entire Lakota culture and bring them to boarding schools and cut all their hair off and give them Christian names and beat them if they spoke their language, and trying to basically exterminate the native culture. That's what they were trying to do. And so this thing had begun again under W. Bush. W. Bush had instigated this program pursuant to which the State Department of Social Services were taking Lakota children away from their parents and away from their grandparents, away from their entire family and their entire culture, and putting them in all-white foster care settings. And I was asked to come in, and Sarah and I went in and met with the grandmothers and ascertained what was going wrong. We set up the Lakota People's Law Office in Rapid City. So we were there on site and had been on site since 2004 for 14 years, when in 2016 this decision got made to move the pipeline from 10 miles north of the 92% white community of Bismarck down to within 250 yards of the border of the 82% Native American Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. So the first people that mobilized to do something about this was a group called the Red Warrior Society of the Ogallala, one of the 7 bands of the Teton, and they were down on Pine Ridge, but they went up to Standing Rock. Now, it's important to conceptually here, and I'm not going to get too deep into this, but it's important that you understand that the United States government moved all of these people into these disparate reservations specifically for the purpose of keeping them away from each other, so they couldn't organize and they couldn't take collective action. Because at the time, like for example, when they established the Standing Rock reservation way up in North Dakota, it was longer than a couple days ride by horseback to get there. And so that they began to curry those people into viewing themselves as separate and distinct from the people, for example, down on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And they viewed themselves, were trained to try to perceive themselves as separate and apart from the people at Cheyenne River or from Rosebud or Yankton, or the other. There's 9 tribes there. They call them tribes, but there are 9 different reservations. And those reservations were originally prison camps. They were actually federal prison camps. And the native people were ordered to be on those prison camps. And they had to wear this rope around their neck with a big printed tag with their ID and everything. And if they were found off the reservation, they could be legally murdered by any white person. And they'd be given a $100 reward. Okay? So that was the origin of these reservations in the attempt to conscientize the native people into believing that they were separate and apart from each other, and to try to foist upon them this completely artificial identity as being a member of this, quote, tribe, like the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. There's no such thing as the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. There's no such thing. They're just the council fires, the bands, the clans, the Teoshpai, the Oshpai, etc. That's all that exists. But what happened is that the Ogallala people from this Red Warrior Society went up to Standing Rock, and they began to protest what was going on there. And so when the pipeline company tried to come down Route 186, I think it is. They come down Route 186 from Bismarck down to where the Standing Rock Reservation was, and bringing these big 18-wheelers hauling these big bulldozers to come in to go up on the land to start bulldozing the land. The young people from the Red Warrior Society went up and stood in their way. And it turns out the police got called, the sheriff's department, the Morton County Sheriff's Department got called, and it turns out the pipeline people were going to be bulldozing a whole bunch of earth all the way to fill this big little gully that ran along the side of Route 186 up to where the land was, where they were going to build the pipeline. They were just going to take it onto themselves to be able to just dig up the earth and build this little earthen rampway on there, so all the equipment could come on up through there. No one ever asked how they got permission to do that. Nobody ever gave them permission to do that. They never applied for permission. They just started doing it. And so the people from the Red Warrior Society stood in the middle of the road and block them from coming in. And now this becomes really important here, because when you get like 8 or 10 or 20, major, beefed up Oglala, if you know what you're talking about, when you get Oglala warriors standing there bare-chested with war paint on in front of you, and you got this big 18-wheeler, and you're deciding as an individual truck driver, you're going to decide you're just going to drive right through there, there is a certain implied dimension of intimidation there, not unlike a strike, in a labor union where they put a picket line in front of a place. And it's varied down through history what degree of resistance the people in the strike line are going to give you if you try to cross the picket line. And so this is something we're going to be discussing in the next few meetings that we have together, of what degree of coercion can you use, what degree of implied threat can you use to try to stop these people who have taken complete control of an entire juridical set of institutions. Not only taken control of them, created all of these juridical institutions to foster and promote their own interests. And so that you have to face the Gandhi question of how much of your life are you going to be devoting to trying to make the rules that they have written for their own benefit to operate against their interests and on behalf of someone who they view as an ultimate other, as Steve Bannon made so clear, that he views the indigenous people as the enemy, as the ultimate other, the people against whom there has to be a new third world war, because they're enemies of capitalism, and they're going to take measures against them because they've had bad experiences with indigenous people. They've had a tough time with the people in Vietnam. They had a tough time with the people in Algeria. They've had a tough time with people in the Middle East, in Afghanistan. They thought they could just go in and kind of mow them down or roll over the top of them or bomb them into oblivion, and somehow these people just keep on coming. And they haven't quite grokked the fact that it's because you're invading their hometown. You're invading their indigenous territory, and they view you as complete invaders. And that's the problem that they've got. And so this is the set of questions that we're going to be faced with now, is to have a discussion about what the role is of the indigenous people in attempting to supplement whatever it is that the white community can do, given the fact that the white community, I'll just state it bluntly, are all chicken shit, and that they're all right inside the system, and they all reap the benefits of the system, and they don't want to do anything to rock the boat, and heaven forbid that they spend a night in jail. I mean, what are their friends going to think? What are their family going to think? And so that there are limitations on what it is that most of the people in the white community are willing to do. And there are others, minority groups, that are being invited into the white community on the peripheries, I might point out, of black people who are well educated, Asian people that are coming in to participate in the system, but they're all part of a juridical system that is willing to distribute certain benefits to them if they stay within the lines. And so that those lines are drawn in a way, like there's an old famous New Yorker cartoon where there's this little boy and little girl standing there. He's all buffed and scrubbed with a little shirt and tie. He's got a little bow tie, and the girl's standing there in her little dress. And the principal is saying to them, "I want to thank you, kids, for being so polite in your protest. Now get your little ass out of my office." At which point they will turn on their heel and leave. Okay? And that's the issue that we're confronted by here, is that the overwhelming majority of the white people and the people that are aspiring to become part of the white power structure in North America want to stay within the boundaries. And the boundaries have been drafted by the elite, by the corporate lawyers, by their judges that they've appointed to the judicial branch, and the legislators whose campaigns they now pay for directly under Citizens United. And they want to stay within the boundaries. So the question is that two things. What percentage of the white community can be talked into doing whatever it is that's necessary to stop global climate change? And what is it that the native indigenous population is willing to do because they've seen the model throughout the world of the indigenous people actually being able to rise up, and even with primitive tools at their disposal, to be able to eject white Western imperialists from coming into their indigenous homeland and harvesting their resources. Okay? And that they have seen that it can be done. And they have been successful in driving them out of there. And so these two questions are what we're going to be dealing with in the final three of our gatherings together. Is to what lengths are white people willing to go? What are the steps that need to be taken to exhaust all of your administrative remedies? How long do you have to stay at this? Do you have to be thrown off the train? Do you have to be thrown off the train for being a WOG, in one of their first-class cabins? And it may be true, but you may have a higher level of consciousness to be able to see that you should come on over before that has to happen to you, to voluntarily be willing to do what it is that's necessary. Now that includes, of course, as I said, doing everything that you can possibly do inside their juridical system to shame them, to confront them with their own rules and regulations, to try to enforce their own rules and regulations against them. We stand at the present moment, for example, with a federal court injunction issued by a white judge up in Montana, stopping the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline on the grounds that it fails to comply with the Environmental Protection Act. So we are at the present moment holding off the construction of the pipeline. But every single day we see all the forces of the pipeline people assembling pipe, bringing in cars and trucks, bringing in bulldozers. They're just getting ready because they know that decision is going to go up to the Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Trump administration and the Federalist Society are all appointing, 236 new federal judges. And they're just feathering them into all the places they need to get control on behalf of the corporations. And not only that, even people in the Democratic Party know that. And they will actually say it in the hearings for those judges. I will not vote for this judge because he's a stooge for the corporations. Like White House, for example, will say that from the Rhode Island, the senator, et cetera. And they'll say it. And they'll lay out in detail why that person should not be there, because they're just a minion for the corporate interests. And they'll actually say it, but that's all they'll do. That's all they'll do. They'll say that, and then they'll vote against them, knowing full well that they're still going to go in. And they won't do anything to disrupt the normal functioning procedures because they've become dependent as a beneficiary of all of those perks from that system. And they won't do it. So the question is, what are the lengths to which we have to go to preserve the legitimacy of the juridical structures that exist, knowing that they've been created by the elite for their own benefit, and that they're victimizing the indigenous and the poor people of the world to participate with or to be of assistance to the indigenous people of the world if they in fact have decided that they're going to do what it is that's necessary to protect their very lives, to protect their very water, to protect their very children and their entire tribe to survive. Okay, so there's two parts of the equation here. Okay, so we're going to be discussing all of that in the next few classes, and I'm going to want you to write your paper at the end about what it is that you think you should do, given your areas of study, given your options, given where you are at your levels of education right now, and what your plans are for graduate school, et cetera. What do you think you should do? And what type of time period do you believe it obtains within which you have to do it? You know, I mean, you may have in plan to have a whole 10-year graduate school career, you know, of doing a PhD, you know, in something. But, you know, that it may behoove you to think in terms of getting out into the world post-haste to try to deal with this situation right now. If, in fact, you believe the evidence. And that's assuming that you have benefited from the education that you've gotten up to this point in time to be able to understand evidence and what's getting ready to happen, but for your intervention. Okay? Thank you. So we'll be back, and I'll see you on Thursday.